quick question. Do you think we are in a spiritual crisis in America? And if we are, do you think that actually matters? So today on the Know What podcast, I want to do something a little different. I want to explore this quick question together and dig into some of the research so that we can actually know why. And so we're going to talk about that question, whether America is in a spiritual crisis. And the reason I wanted to address this is because it was actually in the news recently. You may or may not be aware that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was recently confirmed to head the Health and Human Services Department, or HHS. Now, whether you like RFK Jr. or not, whether you think he should be leading the HHS or not, I think we can all kind of be interested in what he said during his confirmation process. He was in a Fox News interview. And here's what he said. We are not just in a health crisis, but we're in a spiritual crisis. And those things are connected. He said that we have a whole generation of kids that feel alienated, dispossessed. They are in an existential crisis. There's a purposelessness in their lives and no sense of usefulness or effectiveness or connectedness to their communities. And so he goes on to say that this, in his belief, drives some of the addiction epidemic that we've seen. It was really interesting, and especially for somebody who is being placed in that kind of position, that kind of political position of so much power and influence, to be saying that there's a spiritual crisis and that if we want to address our health concerns physically, we need to address them spiritually as well. So again, whether or not you necessarily like RFK Jr. or think he should be the HHS secretary, let's look at some of his claims. First, are we in a spiritual crisis? And second, if we are, is it really a problem? So let's first look at religious affiliation. There's no doubt about it. Pretty much no matter what source you look at, there's no doubt that religious affiliation and activity are declining. So first, let's look at Gallup. According to a 2023 poll, about 3 in 4 Americans say they do identify with a specific religious faith. But 50 years ago, 87% of U.S. adults identified with the Christian religion in particular. And this was interesting because just a few years ago, I remember when this first came out from Gallup, that for the first time in American history, less than half of U.S. adults actually belonged to a house of worship. So currently, less than half Americans, 45%, belong to a formal house of worship, and that has continued to decline. But as recently as 1999, which is really not that long ago, 70% of Americans belong to a house of worship. You can Google religious decline in America and find all kinds of statistics to back up just the fact that, yes, Americans are identifying with organized religion less and less. Now, just a caveat here, you will find a lot of statistics as well that say Americans identify as spiritual but not religious. But we're talking about kind of this corporate involvement in some sort of faith or belief that's actually driving people's, everyday lives or weekly routines. We're not really seeing that as much. So let's go on to the next question. I mean, if you just look at numbers, then yeah, you could say there's a religious crisis in America, institutionally at least. But what does this mean for us? For a long time, people have talked about how if we had less religion, that would be a good thing, because there's no denying that organized religion throughout history all over the world has perpetrated some pretty bad things, or at least bad things have been done in the name of religion. And I think we all know John Lennon's song, Imagine a World with No Religion. And so is this really a problem? And someone that I like to point to is Arthur Brooks. He's an author and a social scientist. He writes a column for The Atlantic called Building a Life. I think that's what it's called, actually. I'll verify that and I'll post it in the show notes. But I definitely recommend reading his stuff because he comes at all of these issues strictly from a scientific perspective based on research and what sociology says about these things. And so he was recently, just last year, a few months ago, he was featured in a podcast put out by The Atlantic called Good on Paper. You can read the transcript or listen to it. I'll post it here. And he says most people do have a sense of something beyond what they see. They have a very strong sense of the metaphysical. Most people believe in life after death. What they don't always believe in is the human institutions around which we coalesce to figure out those metaphysical things and how we're supposed to worship. And so what people have is the same kind of sense of faith. What they don't have is faith in the institutions where they could go and worship. So that's a quote from him. Kind of speaking to what I said a moment ago about how a lot of people still identify as spiritual, but they're just not participating in the, religious routines as much as they were. So does this matter? And this is one of the things that he has found, is that people, and I'm quoting here, who do have a strong sense of religious practice in their life, they just tend to be happier. They tend to be happier people. They have a great sense of organization in their life. They have a better sense of community. They have an underlying physics to their life, and they're not trying to figure things out in the same way as people who identify as nuns religiously or don't have that belief. And so again, he goes on with more evidence. He says, I think the best evidence points to the fact that happiness comes when we can transcend ourselves. In other words, when we are able to connect with or think about something outside of just us as the individual, whenever we are driven to be a part of something bigger and something more meaningful. He admits that he comes from a Christian background, specifically Catholicism, but he's writing all of this information in his column and speaking on this podcast purely just based on the research that he's done. And so he said, I'm not going to say what people should believe or shouldn't believe. It's really, really up to them. But I will look at the notable empirical regularities. And he says that not only as people identify with the religious faith and get involved in that, not only are they happier, but the more they identify with that and get involved, they actually start to adopt more traditional or orthodox norms from those faiths around their lives in terms of like their family life, views on marriage and children and things like that. This is just what the data shows. So I think other people are starting to recognize this as well. So another interesting article I wanted to point out is from the Washington Post. Last year, Washington Post columnist Perry Bacon Jr. wrote about how he was raised in church. He always considered himself to be a Christian, but in the last few years, he's walked away from that. He's not really sure what he believes anymore, but he really misses church. And so he actually argues for a church for the nuns. In other words, people who don't identify with any particular religion. And here's why. He says, my upbringing makes me particularly inclined to see a church-sized hole in American life. But as a middle-aged American in the middle of the country, I don't think that hole is just in my imagination. Kids need places to learn values such as forgiveness, while schools focus on math and reading. Young adults need places to meet a potential spouse. Adults with children need places to meet with other parents and some free babysitting on the weekends. Retirees need a place to build new relationship. And he goes on to say, I can easily imagine a church for the nuns. We would have a service with positive songs and a positive message. Children could participate and then have their own thing. Church members could tell, each other about their highs and lows from the week. They could listen to a sermon on tolerance or some other universal value and touch on issues that were in the news. And then occasionally you have a brunch afterward. So that's his take on just how he misses something, and he notices that there's a hole when there is not kind of that common just experience of belonging to a religious community. Another podcast that came out this week, actually, that I would recommend, and I'll link, is from the New York Times. It's from their Matter of Opinion podcast. And Michelle Cottle they're talking about secularism and whether or not it's good for America, because America is becoming more secular. And so it's interesting because the three co-hosts all kind of come from slightly different backgrounds and have landed in different places in terms of their current religious belief. So one of the hosts, Michelle, says, look, I'm a big fan of faith and generally of organized religion. I do think people have this innate longing for a sense of purpose and to order the universe. And if you're not believing in a divine power, you tend to gravitate toward less savory options like political messiahs and whack job conspiracy theories. She goes on to talk about her experience as a child in the Southern Baptist Church and how she had a lot of religious trauma from that background. And so today she says, I still am a big believer in organized religion, but have I hitched my wagon to something? No, I'm still seeking, so to speak. I thought it was really interesting how she noted that whenever there is a lack of belief in a divine power or a higher power, people tend to go towards less savory options. This was actually something, again, that The Atlantic covered. And I reported on this when I was working for another job back in 2017. The lack of religion, the rise of secularism in America was even kind of helping to explain how brutal our political clashes were becoming. And you have, there's always been arguments and, polarization between the political right and the political left, but you started seeing extremes, even violent extremes on both sides as more and more people on both sides identified less with any sort of religious faith and their main identity became in their political beliefs, which is interesting because it's like when people stop identifying with a religion of some sort, then they make their own religion. And a lot of times the next thing that they go to form their most core values is politics. Again, in practice, people may say, yeah, I believe in God, or I believe in the universe, or I believe in something. But in terms of how people live their daily lives, practically, I think the majority of Americans are living a more secular life. They're not going to church. Their whatever beliefs they may have aren't really driving their involvement in things. We've lost that sense of belonging to a spiritual community. And as we see that play out, we see that people are not as happy. A couple of years ago, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a statement on a study on the loneliness epidemic. So people are lonely. And then RFK Jr. makes the case that a lot of the addiction epidemics and the mental health crises that we're seeing in America are related to this lack of faith and this spiritual crisis. And so I think you are seeing some evidence that's hard to argue with, that we do as humans need some sort of community. We need that sense of purpose and that something that church or, a house of worship or religious institution tends to fill. And even people who have walked away from it because they had frustrations with it, they start to miss the other aspects that they never really thought about before until it was gone. So why do we bring all this up? What does this mean for us? Well, I encourage you to look at the research that I post in the show notes. You can listen to these podcast episodes that I've mentioned or look at this research for yourself just to kind of get a sense of what different people are saying, including people who admit that they're more secular now, about the need for something in America that kind of replaces that role that church used to serve for the majority of Americans. And so I encourage you to look at that and see what you think. But here's my opinion on it. So as a Christian, I'm going to look at what the Bible has to say about it. Theologically speaking, we are taught from the Bible that God is by his own nature a relational God, and that we're made in his image, meaning we are made to reflect his nature in our own nature. And so from the very beginning, he created us to exist in relationship, in partnership with each other. And this is repeated throughout the Bible because in various relational, historical, geographical contexts, whenever God is speaking to humans, he is continually reminding them to get together, to worship together, to join as a community. In fact, in the Old Testament, feasts and celebrations were a big part of just religious ritual and practice. So there was celebration, there was feasting, there was community, there was get-togethers built in to religious life and rhythms in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, we see this encouragement continue. We're told not to neglect gathering with other believers for corporate worship, but even just outside of what we might consider to be church attendance, We are told to be there for one another. Older Christians are admonished to help and encourage younger Christians whenever you have letters in the New Testament to churches who are often experiencing persecution, or maybe they're struggling with different beliefs or doubts. They are told to go to one another, go to those who are older than you and seek encouragement. And they're told to care for each other, particularly, for single moms, for the elderly, for the poor and the needy. So there was really just this ingrained sense in the early church and in the Old Testament as well of community and belonging and needing one another. And so I think that when you look at how even secular sources are acknowledging that we need that, and that a lot of that throughout history has come from being involved in a church or in a religious institution, it's interesting to look and see, oh, the Bible said this. And maybe it's because as humans, we need it. It's not just a rule to follow, but it's actually something that leads to our flourishing. Let's talk about the other part, the transcending ourselves, as Brooks states. So this is another thing that he said in a lot of his research and columns on building a happy life, is that people who have a sense of purpose and meaning outside of themselves, even in what they do for a living, are happier. So I think that a lot of people would acknowledge as humans, we do need that. And that's why people gravitate toward politics as well. When they're not part of a religious institution, they gravitate toward politics because they want to be a part of a bigger movement. So again, when you look at the Bible and Christianity, we're told that we have a purpose to share the good news, to share about Jesus with others, but that doesn't just mean evangelizing. We're told to love our neighbor as ourselves, to care for the poor and needy, to stand up against injustice, to support one another, to pray for one another. Ephesians 2:10 says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So right there, you have biblical explanations for the church-sized hole that many people are feeling today. But I want to add one more point, which I think a lot of these people are really, really close on the truth of what we need, that we do need to be involved in some sort of religious community. We need other people, and we need a shared sense of some sort of higher purpose that we're a part of. But if we just leave it at that, if we take Bacon's idea, for instance, a church for the nuns, and we get together and we sing songs and we have these shared values, and then we go and we advocate for those values, and then we come back together every week. At some point, though, you're going to hit the question of why. Why are we doing this? And another thing that Arthur Brooks said is that in addition to just being happier, people who are really devoted to a religious faith usually care a lot about finding the truth. And they are a part of that faith, and they stay a part of that faith or that religious institution, not just because it makes them happier, that's a byproduct, but the primary concern for them is because they are seeking truth and they believe that what they found is the truth. And so I think eventually that's what all of us are seeking. I think that's even why a lot of people who have left religion and left the church is because they have been seeking that truth, and they start to get skeptical and say, is this really true? And maybe there were some faults with the institutions that they were a part of, and they recognized that. But I think inherently we're going to ask that question of why are we doing this? And I believe the answer to that why is that we were made for relationship, not just with each other, but with God. And I believe the Bible is a true story that starts with the tragedy of us being separated from God and separated from that relationship. And it details the problems that unfold whenever that occurs. But then a hero comes along who, through sacrificing himself, actually restores us to not only that relationship that we were created for, but our intended family, our original calling as humans, and our ultimate identity. And so you don't have to agree with me on that specifically, on Jesus being the why and the story of the Bible being kind of the the key that unlocks all these mysteries that we ask, these questions that we ask about ourselves. But I hope that we can at least acknowledge that there is a spiritual crisis in America. There is this hole in our hearts for some sort of, higher purpose, for a community that shares that purpose that we can belong to. And it's worth asking questions about. And I'm encouraged to see a lot of people exploring that. And I encourage you to as well. So again, I'm linking all of this stuff in the show notes. Go look at it for yourself, read about it for yourself. Feel free to email me and let me know what you think about it, and continue listening to the podcast, because our whole goal here is to help you know why you believe what you believe, and not just say, no, we can't ask that question, but to really dig in and say, okay, well, let's talk about it and let's have a conversation. But I've got to head out because it's Sunday morning as I'm recording this, and I'm headed to church. Have a great week.